Good day everyone, I'm Ana Catarina Garcia Galanto, and in this juncture I will continually discuss about the digestive tract, specifically the stomach, small and large intestine. Let's get started. So first we have here the stomach. For you to be able to follow our discussion, let me give an overall view about our discussion in stomach. The stomach, like a small intestine, is a mix of exocrine endocrine organ that digests food and secretes hormones. Its main function are to continue the digestion of carbohydrates initiated by the amylase of saliva or mouth. Also, to add an acidic fluid to the ingested food, transform it by muscular activity into viscous mass called chyme, and it promotes the initial digestion of proteins with the enzyme pepsin. It also produces a gastric lipase that digests triglycerides by a secreted lipase. The four major regions make up the stomach are the cardia, fundus, body, as well as the pylorus. The mucosa and submucosa of the empty stomach have large, longitudinally directed folds called ragi, which flatten when the stomach fills with food. The wall in all regions of the stomach is made up of all four major layers. These are the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the serosa. So, overall view lang ito siya. Sa next nating mga slides ay i-discuss natin ito siya ng paisa-isa. So, makinig lang kayo na mabuti. Okay, next, let's proceed to our next slide. To begin with, the stomach is greatly dilated segment of the digestive tract whose main functions are to begin digestion of triglycerides by secreted lipase. Other functions are to continue the digestions of carbohydrates initiated by the amylase of saliva, to add an acidic fluid to the ingested food, and mixing its contents into a viscous mass called chyme by the churning activity of the muscularis, and to begin digestions of triglycerides by secreted lipase. So, remember nyo lang dito sa ating stomach na ang main function niya talaga is the digestions of triglycerides by a secreted lipase. Be familiarized with the figure presented in your screen, as this figure shows the four regions of the stomach. As you can see, in the upper right corner of the screen, makikita niyo yung general structure ng ating stomach. Nandiyan ang esophagus, na gaya ng sabi ni Ms. Porras, na ang esophagus ay a muscular tube and about 25 cm long in adults. You can see the four regions of the stomach, which are the cardia, fundus, pylorus, and body, as well as the duodenum and the pyloric sphincter and canal. The cardia, which is seen in the upper left side of the stomach, the body, which makita ninyo sa pinakailalim na slides, as well as the pylorus. Next slide, the medical application. This is an additional information for you to have knowledge about the medical application related sa ato ang stomach. The low level of vitamins B12 can reduce proliferation of erythroblasts, results to pernicious anemia. Okay, so ngayon nandito tayo ngayon sa mucosa. Changing abruptly at the esophagegastric junction, the mucosal surface of the stomach is a simple columnar epithelium that indignates deeply into the lamina propria. Remember that our lamina surrounds as well as support the gastric pits and glands that contains smooth muscle, fibers, lymphoid cells, capillaries, and lymphatics. The invagination form millions of gastric pits, each with opening to the stomach lumen. Take note that the gastric pits lead to long, branched, tubular glands that extend through the full thickness of the lamina propria. And the stem cells for the epithelium lining the glands, pits, and stomach lumen are found in a narrow segment, or what we call isthmus. So, spell nito is ISTHMUS, between each gastric pit and gastric glands. Now, let's proceed to our next slide, which is the four regions of the stomach. Just like what I said earlier, the stomach consists of four regions, and these are the cardia, pylorus, fundus, and the body or corpus. Sorry for typo. Ang fundus natin ay letter U lahat yan siya and not O. Okay? First, we have here the cardia. It is a narrow transitional zone. It is a 1.5 to 3 cm wide between the esophagus and the stomach. Second is the pylorus, which is the funnel-shaped region that opens into the small intestine. Take note that these two regions, cardia and pylorus, are primarily involved with mucus production and are histologically similar. Next, the fundus. It is the body or largest part of the stomach which contains the gastric or what we call fundic glands, and the body or corpus which is the largest section of your stomach. Note that the fundus and body regions are the site of gastric glands releasing acidic gastric juice. So, i-remember nyo lang pag sinabi natin gastric glands, nagre-release siya ng acidic gastric juice. So we have here the four major types and important properties of each are as follows. First is the mucous neck cells are present mainly clustered but also occur singly among the other cells in the neck of gastric glands and include many progenitor and immature surface mucous cells. Less columnar than the surface mucous cells lining the gastric pits, mucous neck cells are often distorted by neighboring cells but they have round nuclei and apical secretory granules. Their mucous secretion is less alkaline than that of the surface epithelial mucous cells. Second is the parietal or eosinophilic cells. It produces hydrochloric acid and are present among the mucous neck cells and throughout deeper parts of the gland. They are large cells, usually appearing rounded or pyramidal. So dito pa lang nakikita na natin yung different ng ating eosinophilic cells pati ng ating mucous cells sa shape pa lang nila, each with one sometimes two central round nucleus. The cytoplasm is intensely eosinophilic due to the high density of the mitochondria. A striking ultrastructural feature of an active parietal cell is a deep circular invagination of the apical plasma membrane to form an intracellular canaliculus with a large surface area produced by 1,000 of microvilli. Third, we have the chief or what we call the zymogenic cells. It predominate in the lower regions of the gastric glands and have all the characteristics of active protein secreting cells. Ultrastructurally, chief cells show abundant RER and numerous apical secretory granules. The granules contains inactive enzymes pepsinogens, precursors which are converted in the acid environment of the stomach into active pepsin. When we say pepsins, these are the endoproteinases with broad specificity and maximal activity at a pH between 1.8 and 3.5. The pepsins initiate the hydrolysis of ingested protein in the stomach. Note that the chief cells also produce a gastric lipase which digests many lipids. And we have here the heteroendocrine cells, or scattered epithelial cells in the gastric mucosa with endocrine or paracrine functions. In the fundus, small enteroendocrine cells secreting serotonin are found at the basal lamina of the gastric glands. In the pylorus, other heteroendocrine cells are located in contact with the glandular lumens, including G cells producing the peptide gastrin. Various enteroendocrine cells secreting different hormones, usually peptides, are also found in the intestinal mucosa and are major importance for functions of the digestive tract. Note that in the cardia and pylorus regions of the stomach, the mucosa also contains tubular glands with long pits branching into cold secretory portions called cardiac glands and pyloric glands. So these glands lack both parietal and chief cells, primarily secreting abundant mucus. So we have here the medical application about the heteroendocrine cells. So tumors called carcinoids which arise from heteroendocrine EC cells are responsible for the clinical symptoms caused by overproductions of serotonin. Serotonin increases gut motility and chronic high levels of this hormone or neurotransmitter can produce mucosal vasoconstrictions and tissue damage. So hindi rin talaga maganda na mataas yung ating serotonin kasi pag tumaas yung ating serotonin, nagkakos ito siya ng damage sa ating mga tissue na nagre-resulta sa tumors na tinatawag nating carcinoids. Moving on, we have here the other layer of the stomach. In all stomach regions, the submucosa is composed of connective tissue with large blood and lymph vessels and many lymphoid cells, macrophages, and mast cell. The muscularis is composed of smooth muscle fibers oriented in three main directions. So what are those three main directions? These are the outer longitudinal layer, a middle circular layer, and an innermost oblique layer. The external layer is what we call longitudinal. The middle layer is circular, and the internal layer is oblique. Rhythmic contractions of the muscularis serve to mix ingested food and chyme with the secretion from the gastric mucosa. At the pylorus, the middle layer is greatly thickened to form the pyloric sphincter. The stomach is covered by a thin serosa. The muscularis regular contractions thoroughly combine ingested food and chyme with mucus, HCI, and digestive enzymes from the stomach mucosa in the slide. The pyloric sphincter, gaya ng sabi ko kanina, is formed when the middle layer of the stomach thickens significantly at the pylorus, and the stomach is covered by a thin serosa. Now, before we proceed to our next organ, which is the small intestine, let me give you a brief recap about stomach. Like what I said earlier, the superior cardia and inferior pylorus, which are histologically similar, as well as the intervening fundus and body, are the four primary regions of the stomach. The stomach mucosa, fundus, and body are penetrated by a multiple gastric pits lined with the same material as the stomach lumen, having mucous cells on the surface, which branch into stomach branching glands. Let's not forget also that a thick layer of viscous mucus is secreted by the surface mucous cells. Parietal cells are big cells with several mitochondria and a huge surface area. Intracellular canaliculi and the gastric mucosa for HCI synthesis secretion. They release the intrinsic factor for vitamin B12 uptake. I also discussed about what chief cell is. Remember that the chief cells are mostly in the lower half of the body. Moving on, let's now proceed to our next organ, which is the small intestine. The small intestine is the site where the digestive processes are completed and where the nutrients or products of digestions are absorbed by cells of the epithelial lining. The small intestine is relatively long, approximately 5 meters, and consists of 3 segments, the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. These segments have most histologic features in common and are discussed together. The duodenum, jejunum, and ileum are the 3 segments of the small intestine to remember. It aids in the digestion of meals from the stomach. It absorbs nutrients from meals such as vitamins, minerals, carbs, lipids, proteins, and water so that the body can use them. The small intestine is a portion of the digestive system that is vital to our health. Why? Because without it, our bodies would not be able to absorb enough nutrients and water from the food we eat. So what the cause of this? It causes digestive issues such as diarrhea, which can be hazardous if left untreated. Now, let's proceed to our next step. When viewed macroscopically, the lining of the small intestine shows a series of permanent circular or semilunar folds, or what we call plicae circularis, consisting of mucosa and submucosa, which are best developed in the jejunum. Densely covering the entire mucosa of the small intestine are short, 0.5 to 1.5 mm mucosal outgrowths called villi that project into the lumen. Remember that the villi of the small intestine project into the intestinal cavity, greatly increasing the surface area for food absorption and adding digestive secretion. These finger or leaf-like projections are covered by a simple columnar epithelium of absorptive cells called enterocytes, with many interspersed goblet cells. In the small intestine, the amount of enterocytes is about 80% of the total epithelial cells. The main function of the enterocytes is to absorb molecules from the gut lumen and their transport toward the surrounding of connective tissue and blood vessels. Each villus has a core of loose connective tissue that extends from the lamina propria and contains fibroblasts, smooth muscle fibers, lymphocytes and plasma cells, fenestrated capillaries, and a central lymphatic called a lacteal. The term lacteals aid in the transfer of digestive lipids from the small intestine's villi. How this happened? The lacteal is a lymphatic capillary in the small intestine that absorbs dietary lipids. The lacteals join to form bigger lymphatic vessels that carry validation to the thoracic duct, where it is discharged into the bloodstream via the subclavian vein. Lacteals are a part of the lymphatic system which is meant to absorb and transport material that is too big to be absorbed directly into the bloodstream. So, we have here the medical application which is related siya sa stomach and small intestine. So, ano nga ba yung mga disease or medical application na meron sa stomach and small intestine? So, we have here the leiomyomas. It is a benign tumor of smooth muscle cells or the most common type of tumor found in the stomach and small intestine and may become large. We also have here the celiac disease. It is a disorder of the small intestine mucosa that causes malabsorption and can lead to damage or destruction of the villi. So we have here the absorptive surface of the small intestine. So look at the first picture which can be found on the upper left side of your screen. This figure shows layers of the absorptive surface of the small intestine. The mucosa and submucosa are the inner two of the guts for concentric layers. And then nakita niyo yung arrow na pababa? That figure shows the section of small intestine where they form circular folds or what we call plica circularis, which increase the absorptive area. Next, the letter C, which the figure shows intestinal villus. They are lined by a dense covering of finger-like projections called villi. Internally, each villus contains lamina propria connective tissue with microvasculature and lymphatics called lacteals. Following, the next figure, letter D, which shows intestinal villi. Villi are covered with simple columnar epithelium composed of absorptive enterocytes and goblet cells. And the last figure, which is kanang color black and white, shows the microvilli. Here, the apical cell membrane of each enterocytes are located dense microvilli, which serves to increase greatly the absorptive surface of the cell. Now, we have here the epithelium of the intestinal glands includes differentiating cells and pluripotent stem cells for all the cell types of the small intestine. These include the following. First, we have here the enterocytes. The absorptive cells are tall columnar cells, each with an oval nucleus located basally. The apical end of each enterocyte display a prominent order region called the striated or brush border. Also structurally, the striated border is seen to be a layer of densely packed microvilli covered by a glycocalyx through which nutrients are taken into the cells. Second, we have here the goblet cells. It is an interspersed among the absorptive enterocytes. They secrete glycoprotein mucus, which are then hydrated to form mucus, whose main function is to protect and lubricate the lining of the intestine. Third, we have here the Paneth cells. It is located in the basal portion of the intestinal crypts below the stem cells, are exocrine cells with large eosinophilic secretory granules in their apical cytoplasms. Paneth cell granules release lysosomes, phospholipase A, and hydrophobic peptides called defensins, all of which bind in breakdown membranes of the microorganisms and bacterial cell walls. Paneth cells have an important role in innate immunity and in regulating the microenvironment of the intestinal crypts. So, each, as previously said, a microvillus is a 1 meter height and 0.1 meter diameter cylindrical outgrowth of the apical cytoplasm. It is surrounded by the cell membrane and having actin filaments. Each enterocyte has 3,000 microvilli on average, as well as each 1 millimeter squared. They are approximately 200 cells on the mucosal surface. These contractions number in the millions, the plicae, microvilli, and the villi. All circularis significantly enhance the mucosal surface area in the mouth. In an organ specialized for nutrition absorption, contact with nutrients in the lumen is crucial aspect. Plicae are thought to enhance the size of the intestine. The villi increase the surface area by a factor of 3, the surface area by a factor of 10, and the surface area by a factor of 10. Microvilli boost it by a factor of 20 more, resulting in a total of absorptive area of over 200 m squared in the intestine of the small intestine. So number 4, we have here the heteroendocrine cells. It is present in varying numbers throughout the length of the small intestine, secreting various peptide hormones. Many of these are of the open type, in which the constricted apical end of the cell contacts the intestinal lumen and has chemoreceptor like those of taste buds. Sampling levels of certain nutrients such as sugars to regulate hormone release basally. Number 5, we have here the M cells or the microfold cells. It is a unique epithelial cell specialized for transepithelial transport of particles and microorganisms, located mainly in the ileum's mucosa, overlying the lymphoid follicles of Peyer's patches. As previously mentioned, each M cells include a pocket that is produced by the lymphocytes, and macrophages are contained within a deeply invaginated basolateral membrane. The M cells and immune cells within and below the M cells continuously sample intestinal bacteria, which is an important aspect of mucosal immunity's protection. Now, before we proceed to large intestine, let's have first a recap about small intestine. The small intestine is divided into 3 sections. What are those? We have here the duodenum, which contains the large intestine, the jejunum, which contains the small intestine, and the ileum. In the jejunum, remember that duodenal glands in the submucosa, mucous glands in the submucosa. Peyer's patches on the mucosal and submucosal surfaces of the ileum. The mucosa of the small intestine has millions of projecting cells in every location. Villi have simple columnar epithelium over lamina propria course, with simple tubular intestinal glands in between. Lipid digestion products bind to bile salts and are taken up by the liver. When we say enterocytes, they are transformed into the triglycerides and lipoproteins. Remember that each villus has a core. Lamina propria smooth muscle and muscularis mucosae. Lastly, villi are moved and lymph is pushed via the lacteals. Okay, now let's move on in our next layer, which is the large intestine. The large intestine or bowel, which absorbs water and electrolytes and forms indigestible material into feces, has the following regions: the short cecum, which is the ileocecal valve, and the appendix, the ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon, and the rectum, where feces are stored prior to evacuation. The mucosa lacks villi and except in the rectum has no major folds. Less than 1/3 as long as the small intestine, the large intestine has greater diameter 6 to 7 cm. The wall of the colon is broken into a series of large sacs called haustra. Here, we can tell na ang large intestine ay much shorter than the small intestine, which is 22 feet. It's called the large intestine because it's wider, about 3 inches, while the small intestine is only 1 inch in diameter. The large intestine, unlike the small intestine, does not manufacture digestive enzymes. Before the chyme reaches the large intestine, chemical digestion is accomplished in the small intestine. Functions of the large intestine include the absorption of water and electrolytes and the elimination of feces. The muscularis of the colon has longitudinal and circular layers but differs from that of the small intestine, with fibers of the outer layer gathered in 3 separate longitudinal bands called tinae coli. Now, take a look at the figures shows in your screen and be familiarized with it. The first figure, which is the left side of your screen, shows the large intestine tunnels. This diagram shows the wall of the large intestine composed of the 4 typical layers. The submucosa is well vascularized. The muscularis has a typical inner circular layer, but the outer longitudinal muscle is only present in 3 equally spaced bands, the tinae coli. And the figure found on the right side of your screen shows the large intestine mucosa and submucosa. The mucosa is occupied mostly by tubular intestinal glands extending as deep as muscularis mucosae and by lamina propria rich in MALT. Next slide, medical application. This is an additional information for you to have knowledge about this kind of disease. We have here the colorectal cancer. It is the adenocarcinoma that develops initially from benign adenomatous polyps in the mucosal epithelium. Next slide, anal canal. In anal canal, the distal end of the GI tract is the anal canal. It is 3 to 4 cm long. At the recto-anal junction, the simple columnar mucosal lining of the rectum is replaced by stratified squamous epithelium. The mucosa and submucosa of the anal canal form several longitudinal folds. the anal columns, in which the lamina propria and submucosa include sinuses of the rectal venous plexus. Near the anus, the circular layer of the rectums muscularis form the internal anal sphincter. Defecation involves the action of voluntary muscles comprising the external anal sphincter. In the anal region, the mucous membrane forms a series of longitudinal folds, the anal columns. And gaya ng sabi ko kanina, it is 2 cm above the anal opening. At the recto-anal junction, the lining of the mucosa is replaced by stratified squamous epithelium. In this region, the lamina propria contains a plexus of large veins that, when excessively dilated and varicose, can produce hemorrhoids. The simple columnar epithelium with tubular intestinal glands in the rectum left side of photo changes abruptly to stratified squamous epithelium in the anal canal right side of the photo, as seen in this longitudinal section. So, mauna ni siya kanang figure na nakita sa screen na nakapop sa screen ninyo. The connective tissue of the lamina propria is seen to contain many free lymphocytes. Ayan siya, mga lymphocytes. Okay, next slide, we have here the medical application. So, nabanggit natin kanina yung word na hemorrhoids. It is swollen blood vessels in the mucosa or submucosa of the anal canal and can cause a painful disorder. Additional information lang din na ang hemorrhoids ay tinatawag ding piles. It has 2 types, which are the internal and external hemorrhoids. So, when we say internal hemorrhoids, these are usually painless. Pero, ayan, may pero. It is tend to bleed, while external hemorrhoids may cause pain. Moving on in our last slide, which shows the summary of distinguishing digestive tract features by regions and layers. So before that, let me give you first the recap about large intestine for you to be able to understand this table. The large intestine is divided into 3 sections: the short cecum, the long cecum, and the large intestine, with the appendix, the long colon, with its ascending transverse, the rectum as well as the ascending, sigmoid, and descending parts. Remember, the mucosa of the big intestine has millions of cells running the length of it, and the muscularis of the colon has its outer longitudinal layer subdivided into 3 bands of smooth muscle called tania. And that's it, the brief summary of our large intestine. So, proceed tayo ngayon dito sa ating table, which shows the summary of distinguishing digestive tract features by region and layers. So, ano nga ba yung mga region and subdivisions natin? Meron tayong esophagus, which reported by Miss Dana, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and the anal canal. So, nandito rin ating mga layers, no? Nandiyan yung mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and the serosa. So, sa mucosa, ang esophagus natin is stratified squamous epithelium and cardiac glands. Sa stomach naman, surface mucous cells and gastric pits leading to gastric glands with parietal and chief cells. Sa small intestine, we have here the plicae circularis, villi with erythrocytes and goblet cells, and the glands with Paneth cells and stem cells, pair patches in ileum. Large intestine, we have here the intestinal glands with goblet cells and absorptive cells. In anal canal, stratified squamous epithelium, longitudinal anal columns. Sa submucosa naman ng esophagus, meron siyang esophageal glands. Ang stomach, no distinguishing features gaya ng ating large intestine. Ang small intestine, meron siyang duodenal or what we call Brunner glands. And sa anal canal, meron siyang venous sinuses. Under muscularis, ang esophagus ay meron siyang striated muscles in upper region, both layers smooth muscles in lower region, smooth and striated muscles fascically mingled in middle region. Ang stomach, meron siyang 3 distinct layers of smooth muscles na sinabi natin kanina. Ito na yung inner oblique, middle circular, and outer longitudinal. Ang small intestine naman ay wala siyang distinguishing features. Sa large intestine, meron tayong tinatawag na tinae coli. Sa anal canal naman, meron tayong tinatawag na internal sphincter. Next, dito naman tayo sa last column. Ito na ang ating serosa. Sa esophagus, meron siyang serosa except at lower end with serosa. Stomach, serosa. Small intestine, mainly serosa. large intestine mainly serosa with adventitia at rectum, and anal canal meron tayong adventitia. And that's it for this part 1 of our report, which we discussed what digestive tract is and what are the region and subdivision of it. Now, it's Mr. Cloud's turn to discuss and explain part 2 of our report, which deals with the organs of the digestive tract. Take it away, Mr. Cloud.